In 1940, under US President Thomas Dewey's administration, America watched from the sidelines as the world went to war. However, America's neutrality would be violated when on December 7, 1941, the Japanese Empire launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, followed by a declaration of war from Japan and Germany. Now an active participant in the war, the beleaguered Americans scrambled to organize a military response. America's late entry in the war would not save the fate of the Allies. Just as the first American troops were arriving in Britain, Germany had landed on the shores of England. The Allied armies organized a desperate defense of the British Isles. Despite the valiant efforts of the Allies, they were eventually forced to evacuate from Britain by April 1945. In August that year, President Dewey signed the official peace accords, ending the state of war between the US and the Axis powers. Under the terms of the Akagi Accords, the United States had to surrender most of its Pacific possessions, as well as its major ports and naval bases in Los Angeles and San Francisco, to the Japanese. To consolidate what little influence they had in the world, the United States established the Organization of Free Nations with her remaining allies in North America and Oceania. The stated goal of the OFN was to ensure the sovereignty of the Americas and the South Pacific, and to protect liberalism across the world. Throughout the 60s and 70s, the US and the OFN would back armed groups that challenged the German and Japanese spheres of influence. The year 1962 would see a major escalation in OFN assistance to anti-German and anti-Japanese groups. In the Japanese military government of Shonan Marai, a group known as the United Malayan Anti-Japanese Front, UMAJF, led by Chin Peng, waged a relentless guerrilla war against the Japanese. These Maoist guerrillas would receive aid from the OFN under the Nixon administration, who pragmatically saw them as allies against Japanese control in Southeast Asia. The ferocity of the UMAJF guerrillas, with the support of the US, were able to achieve rapid victories against the Japanese. On the 20th of January 1962, the Japanese army vacated mainland Malaya. In the wake of their victory, Malaya held elections which were won by the conservative Tun Abdul Razak, to the delight of Washington. Despite this blow to the Japanese sphere, the Malayan debacle would quickly be overshadowed by an economic crisis that would hit Japan. The Yasuda Zaibatsu, a financial conglomerate of the Yasuda clan, had conspired with the Japanese army and petty warlords to embezzle funds for oil drilling operations in Manchuria. When an investigation leaked the information to the public, the Japanese stock market crashed. Overnight, corporations lost 50% of their valuation, workers were laid off, and the entire Japanese economic sphere grinded to a halt. Worsening the Japanese position in the Pacific, the years-long insurgency in the Philippines mounted a joint offensive against the Japanese-aligned Jose Yulo government. On the 7th of April 1963, the American-aligned Free Philippine Republic, or FPR, took Manila, sending the Yulo government into exile. 2 months after their victory on June 7, 1963, Japan would launch a retaliatory invasion of the Philippines, landing on Luzon Island and capturing the cities of San Fernando and Dagupan. Backed by American arms and intelligence, the forces of the FPR managed to repel the Japanese invasion on June 27, 1963. America's decision to assist the UMAJF and FPR in Southeast Asia was guided by the core doctrine of American foreign policy in the era, known as the Rollback Doctrine. This doctrine posits that the United States must actively push back on the dual hegemonies of Germany and Japan. Because of the humiliating defeat in 1945, the US held an unenviable geopolitical position. Germany's chokehold on Europe and Japan's unquestioned dominance in Asia greatly limited the US's access to global resources and markets, limiting economic growth and isolating America politically from the Old World. To reverse this fate, the Rollback Doctrine proposes sending aid to any political group who actively resists Germania and Tokyo. Through this guiding doctrine, American liberalism might survive the 20th century. Meanwhile, in Europe, a political crisis was brewing that would set the German Reich ablaze. A failed assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler would set the NSDAP scrambling for a successor. In the end, Party Chancellor Martin Bormann was selected to ensure a continuation of Hitler's policies. However, the three other candidates also vied for power and disapproved of Bormann's nomination, utilizing their own power bases. Security Minister Hermann Göring, Economic Minister Albert Speer, and SS Reichsführer Reinhard Heydrich plotted. The power struggle between the four would break out into full-blown civil war when Adolf Hitler died on the 19th of October 1963. With the government in Germania paralyzed, opposition groups within the German sphere, also known as the Unity Pact or Einheitspact in German, took the opportunity to launch armed uprisings. In Britain, the revolt against German-backed rule would be led by Her Majesty's Most Loyal Resistance, or HMMLR, under former head of the MI5, Maxwell Knight. Exploiting the chaos engulfing the Unity Pact, the HMMLR assassinated Prime Minister Barry Domville at his office at 10 Downing Street. The assassination of Domville was the first act of armed revolt against the government in London. Across Britain, in the countryside, the towns, and the cities, underground combat groups rose up in arms to wrestle control from government troops. Caught by surprise and abandoned by Germania, the government hastily organized a counterattack, but to no avail. After only 1 month of fighting, on December 10, 1963, the HMMLR would enter London and drive the German collaborationist government out of Britain. To prevent another German invasion, the HMMLR and the OFN would negotiate the entry of Britain into the alliance. Similar anti-German uprisings would occur in Eastern Europe, but unlike the British revolt, these uprisings would be quickly put down by the local German administration, the Reichskommissariats. In times of relative order, they answered to the government in Germania. However, with a civil war raging in Germany, the Reichskommissariats had no clear authority to answer to. The power vacuum allowed ambitious administrators to take more unilateral decisions without interference from the metropole. In Africa, the three RCs of East Africa, Central Africa, and Southwest Africa, colloquially known as the Africa Shield, used this opportunity to intervene in the political crisis brewing down south in the Union of South Africa. The crisis in South Africa ignited when the Boers declared the independence of their free state from the Union of South Africa. Stemming from years of tension between the Boer, the Anglo, and the native African populations. This triggered an armed conflict between the Boers and the South African government, a conflict which the Africa Shield were quick to side with the Free State. Fearing the combined strength of the Boer and Shield armies, the South Africans requested immediate assistance from the US. Despite not being a formal member of the OFN, the US saw it crucial to defend South Africa's sovereignty as a part of the wider struggle against German influence. As a result, they called for a security meeting of the OFN, which ratified Security Resolution 13, declaring that the OFN will defend South Africa as if it were one of their own members. Soon, American and Commonwealth troops would enter South Africa, directly facing off the Boer and Shield armies. It became immediately clear that the Shield armies and their Boer allies were severely under-equipped to confront the OFN forces in South Africa. Lack of support from the native African populations also made it difficult for them to wage their war effort. Within weeks of the American-led intervention, Bloemfontein would fall to the Allies. The routed Shield armies desperately defended their fallback lines, one after the other, as American bombs scattered their positions. The success of the OFN offensives were a shock even to the OFN commanders. The successes proved to the Allied commanders that they could carry out more ambitious objectives. The road to Africa's liberation had opened. In rapid-fire succession, the Shield armies fell one by one. The first to fall was the Boer Free State on December 27, 1963, followed by Southwest Africa on February 4, 1964, and East Africa the following month. In April, half a year into the OFN intervention, German presence in Africa was all but gone. The task fell to the Americans to reconstruct and re-establish civilian authority in Africa. The OFN established 3 mandates, following the administrative borders of the RCs, to work towards the goal of liberalizing Africa. Germania could only issue a diplomatic protest as they lost control over their resource mining operations in the African continent, which now fell into the hands of their American adversaries. While the OFN won a great many victories against the Germans and Japanese overseas, at home, a political crisis threatened to shake the American political establishment. The Nixon administration had engaged in a campaign of dirty tricks by utilizing their ties with the FBI to weaken the opposition. While the campaign had worked wonderfully for the RDC's electoral successes, the exposing of it would torpedo Nixon's presidency. On June 10, 1964, with the threat of impeachment impending, Richard Nixon chose to resign from the presidency on his own accord. The office of president would thus fall on the progressive Vice President John F. Kennedy. However, his presidency would not last long, when an assassin shot him dead not 2 months after taking office. The political chaos would shake the stable ship which the RDC had tried to steer for many years. A major catalyst for the political chaos in the streets was the polarizing issue of segregation. This hypocrisy was a racist stain on the supposed heroism of the American-led OFN fight against fascism, as African Americans were treated as second-class citizens at home. Despite the passing of the Civil Rights Act during Nixon's presidency, the issue of race relations would continue to be a thorn in the side of the RDC and their promise of desegregation. Many conservative elements within the coalition disagreed with the policy, while the progressives disliked how watered down the act had become. This caused many within the party to defect to the National Progressives. Many thought that the establishment would not survive the next election, thoughts which were quickly dispelled when Republican Wallace F. Bennett narrowly won the presidential election of 1964 against the opposition National Progressive Party. As America slowly returned to political stability with the election of Wallace Bennett, so too did Germany as the devastating civil war that rocked the European power came to a close. In the end, Hitler's chosen successor and NSDAP Chancellor Martin Bormann was able to militarily defeat his rivals for leadership, securing the title of Führer and solidifying his control over the country. As the internal situation in Germany stabilized, the Führer began looking outward to regain control over what was once the Unity Pact. This task would be easier in some places than others. In particular, the fall of Britain to pro-OFN forces would prove a massive roadblock to Bormann's goal of reunifying the Unity Pact. In conjunction to that, the prospect of American nuclear armaments in such close proximity to Germany would also be seen as an existential threat. To address the concerns, German military planners would begin drawing up operations to seize the British Isles once more by June 1964. However, as the Reich began its military buildup across the Channel in late July 1964, the United States responded in full force by deploying the American Navy around the southern English coast, initiating a months-long military standoff known to many as the Channel Crisis. Eventually, constant American military presence would prove too much of a risk for any invasion of Britain to commence, and thus Germany began a humiliating withdrawal of its military buildup in late October 1964, ending the Channel Crisis with a resounding OFN victory. The years 1963 and 64 saw American foreign policy place greater emphasis on rolling back the unstable German sphere. In 1965, with Bormann's restoration of order in Europe, America once again pivoted towards Asia and the Japanese sphere. The outbreak of civil war in Indonesia would be the first opportunity in 2 years for the US to intervene in Asian affairs. The political crisis, which eventually exploded into civil war, began as a result of Indonesian President Sukarno's centralization of power, culminating in the declaration of martial law in March 1965. The Vice President, Muhammad Hatta, resigned as a result, disappearing from the capital and re-emerging in the island of Sumatra. He, alongside a coalition of rebel generals and local warlords, announced their goal of resisting Sukarno. Washington immediately contacted the Free Indonesian government, stating the US's intention to support their war effort. American-made weapons would fall into the hands of the Hattaists, who used their newly acquired guns to fight Sukarno's army. Fighting immediately began as the two opposing forces battled it out in the rainforests of Indonesia. The first 3 months of fighting were characterized by low-intensity skirmishing by poorly trained militiamen, as very little ground was gained on either side. This would change in June that year when American and Japanese military advisors arrived on the battlefield. The combat quickly evolved into mobile warfare as both sides used mobile helicopter units to bypass the thick rainforests. To defeat the entrenched mountain positions of Sukarno's armies, America authorized the use of napalm bombs, burning large swaths of the West Javan rainforests and inflicting a major loss of life for the local population. While terrible, Hatta saw this as a necessary evil to free Indonesia from Sukarno's rule. By July 20th, 1965, the Sukarnoists no longer held the centers of power and thus surrendered to Hatta. The victory of free Indonesia would see yet another Japanese-aligned country overthrown by an American-supported rebel group. As the Indonesian Civil War ended in America's favor, another conflict began to brew across the Indian Ocean in South Asia. Ever since the end of the Second World War, India had been ruled by two rival governments, with both claiming to be the sole authority of the Indian subcontinent. Geopolitically, the Calcutta-based government of Free India, under the leadership of Subhash Chandra Bose, enjoys direct backing from Japan. Meanwhile, the Delhi-based Republic of India under Morarji Desai and the Indian National Congress enjoys relative support from the OFN. In 1965, tensions between the two sides reached a fever pitch after the failure of unification negotiations and an assassination attempt on the life of Free Indian President Chandra Bose. On the eve of New Year 1966, a series of border clashes would escalate to full-scale war between the two sides, beginning the Indian Reunification War. At the offset of the war, Desai's government experienced massive defeats at the hand of Bose's army. Within the first few months of the war, Free India was able to capture the major cities of Lucknow and Kanpur while inflicting significant casualties on Republic of India troops. Already facing many setbacks, the Republic of India soon had to contend with the opening of a second new front, as the newly formed country of Pakistan began military incursions of the Republic of India's western borders to claim its Muslim-majority regions. Despite this, Delhi managed to blunt Calcutta and Peshawar's offensives, stabilizing the front line and ensuring that the war effort would continue for years. Although Britain, Indonesia, and South Africa vindicated former President Richard Nixon's rollback doctrine, Bennett's administration would revise this strategy quite a bit. Under Bennett, Washington would place greater emphasis on establishing close ties with neutral countries that weren't exactly a part of Germany or Japan's spheres. Of these neutral countries, one that stood out amongst them is the former Axis power of Italy. The Kingdom of Italy had been one of the German Reich's primary allies during the Second World War, and even early into the post-war world order. But cordial relations between the two countries deteriorated after the war, and even more so when the West Russia War erupted. In the end, Italy would leave the Axis to form the triumvirate with Iberia and Turkey. As a fascist state, Italy did not seem like an obvious target for American diplomatic overtures, but this would change with two developments. The first was the disintegration of the triumvirate in early 1962, which saw war erupt between Italy and Turkey, officially cementing Italy's status as a neutral power. The second development was the democratizing reforms of Italy, announced all the way back in August 1963 by Duce Ciano in the Verona Conference. By 1965, Italy had held their first democratic elections, which was won by the centrist Christian Democracy Party. With a democratic government in power and their own alliance shattered, Prime Minister Aldo Moro declared that Italy would begin the process of formally joining the OFN to dissuade aggressive German posturing. Italy's entry into the OFN would be a major diplomatic victory for the Bennett administration, proving to decision-makers and theorists alike that his approach to foreign policy had its merits. In Central Africa, after almost 2 years of military administration, the OFN finalized the process of granting independence to African states. This was achieved through cooperation and negotiation between the OFN mandate officials and local political actors. OFN decolonization of Central Africa began with the formation of the East African Federation and the Republic of Zambia. Following the success in East Africa, Angola would soon be granted independence and become a member of the OFN. The decolonization process in Congo would also proceed smoothly as the former territory of the Mandate would bring to birth 3 new nations: the Congolese Republic, the Republic of Orungu, and the Biafran Republic. However, in exchange for political independence, these newly independent states would still be tied to the American economic sphere, limiting their independence in socio-economic affairs. Following the decolonization of Africa, the OFN would experience a string of victories against their geopolitical rivals. One after the other, the weakest members of the German and Japanese spheres would fall to pro-OFN pressures. Analysts would attribute these events to the successful application of rollback doctrine. Theorists referred to the domino-like effect of the recent OFN victories as the observable proof of the domino theory. The domino theory suggests that if one country fell into the hands of the OFN, neighboring countries will follow. In South America, Colombia fell to pro-OFN Gaetanist rebels who managed to defeat rival factions in their civil war, ending German, Japanese, and Iberian hopes of an ally in the region. Sensing the encroaching threat of OFN influences in the Caribbean, President Trujillo of the Dominican Republic preemptively invaded pro-OFN Haiti. This invasion would fail and result in a Haitian occupation of the Dominican Republic and the establishment of a democratic provisional government. Meanwhile, in West Africa, the OFN's ideals would be put to the test as the Free France government waged a colonial war against the Pan-African Liberation Front. President Bennett would back Charles de Gaulle's regime, an act which many Africans saw as a betrayal. Nonetheless, American arms and France's network of African collaboration governments would overcome the Pan-Africanists, cementing French colonial rule for decades to come. In 1969, the OFN would once again be granted a major victory in Europe, when the French state, under the reformist Prime Minister Antoine Pinay, re-established the French Republic and allowed the return of the Free French exiles. Charles de Gaulle's return to the homeland was especially greeted with applause by the civilian population. Despite his old age, de Gaulle would run for president in the elections, which were held in September. Riding the wave of popular support, he would win the election and become president of France. To solidify their position internationally, France would formally join the OFN in August 1969, bringing along their West African collaboration governments into the alliance. This move would cement the OFN's position in mainland Europe, denying German access to the North Atlantic Ocean and creating a defensive bulwark stretching from the lowlands to the Alps. By the tail end of the 1960s, the Cold War tensions, which had reached a boiling point after the German Civil War, would once again die down. What followed was a period of warming relations between the great powers as they sought to find common ground by holding conferences and signing agreements to maintain the stability of their respective spheres. The first of such agreements would come in March 1969, when the United States and Japan held a joint announcement of a comprehensive treaty between the two nations. In a shock to many, the United States would regain control over Hawaii and the treaty ports in Los Angeles and San Francisco, in exchange for giving Japan access to America's lucrative petroleum market after decades of embargo. This victory, which came within months after his re-election in late 1968, would cement Wallace Bennett's legacy as one of the most successful US presidents in recent US history. Following the momentum of the successful US-Japan treaty, America would soon negotiate with the German Reich to reduce tensions in Europe. This would culminate in the highly publicized Stockholm Conference, where US President Wallace Bennett and German Führer Martin Bormann would meet face to face. Although the Stockholm Conference would initially be a success, the commitment of both sides to it would be tested 2 months later with the collapse of Heinrich Himmler's secretive Order State of Burgundy. as both Germany and France both sought to retake control over the region. A race to occupy as much of its territory would ensue, reigniting tensions and resulting in the Burgundian standoff between the Unity Pact and the OFN. Fortunately, cooler heads prevailed as an agreement between the two sides would be reached, resulting in the Paris Agreement of May 1970. The agreement would have both sides withdrawing all military personnel from the border and establishing a demilitarized zone, ending the crisis and reinforcing the goodwill first established in the Stockholm Conference. As the United States finalized their agreements with their geopolitical rivals, those same rivals, the former great powers of the Axis, began to reconcile among themselves. Setting aside decades of rivalry, Tokyo and Germania formally announced a declaration of friendship in July 1970. Their decision to repair ties may stem from the constant string of victories made by the OFN in various proxy conflicts waged over the years. Nevertheless, the agreement followed the détente trend of the late 60s and early 70s. However, the stability of the 70s would be rudely interrupted when the entire Middle East erupted into civil war. It all started on October 10, 1970, in the Mutawakkalite Kingdom of Yemen, with a military revolt against the monarchy. King al-Badr would quickly receive support from the Italians and the Saudis, who deemed the rebellion to be a threat to their hold over the Middle East. The Italians especially felt the urgency to snuff out any revolt against their sphere of influence. It must be understood that by the end of the Second World War, Italy gained a significant stake in the region through oil contracts and territorial acquisitions throughout Arabia, Egypt, the Gulf, Iraq, and the Levant. However, it would be these exact state of affairs that angered the Arabs to revolt. Abdullah al-Salal, leader of the military rebellion, aimed to overthrow the puppet monarchy of Yemen and to unify all Arabs under one republic. His actions would inspire all sorts of similar revolts around the Middle East, as underground networks of disgruntled Arab officers took up arms against their own pro-Italian governments. One by one, civil wars erupted across the region, first in Iraq, then in Oman, followed by Egypt and Sudan. Anti-Italian Republican revolutionaries would start a preemptive coup in Iraq, taking control of the country for 3 months before an OFN-backed Italian counterattack crushed them. This would be paralleled in Egypt, which saw the revolting officers defeated 1 month after their uprising. The revolutionaries in Oman would see better luck as the Italian garrisons found themselves stretched thin. Meanwhile, in Yemen itself, al-Salal's pan-Arab rebels would fight bitterly against the king and his Saudi backers. When the Yemeni Republican armies eventually broke through the royalist Yemeni forces and sent them scrambling, they turned their guns towards Riyadh. Following the breakout of the Arab revolts in the Middle East, the stocks of the ENI, Italy's most prominent oil company, fell drastically. Because of Italy's role as a major player in world trade, the fall of ENI's stocks would be felt across the world as oil prices skyrocketed. Suddenly, the world would experience a shortage of oil, a crucial component of a modern economy. The oil crisis, as it would be known, would be a source of political instability all across the globe. The oil shortage resulting from the oil crisis would see ramifications in the longest-spanning war of the 1960s and 70s so far, that being the Indian Reunification War. By 1971, after 5 years of a conflict and 500,000 military casualties on both sides, the brutal war had turned in the favor of Delhi. However, Calcutta still put up a stiff resistance. With the beginning of the oil crisis, Calcutta's war machine began running into operational and logistical problems. Eventually, their armies would begin to buckle under the pressure of Delhi's offensives. Finally, in February 1971, the last remnants of the Free Indian Forces would surrender to the Republic of India, ending the war decisively for the OFN's allies. While the rest of the world buckled under the effects of the oil crisis, rare news would emerge out of the cold Siberian tundras. It appeared that over the years, 2 factions would rise from the Russian Civil War: the Omsk-based Russian National Reclamation Government and the Novosibirsk-based Siberian Federation. Unable to formulate the terms of a peaceful unification, the two sides marched to war to become the sole sovereign of Russia in February 1972. By August that year, the Omsk government would surrender to Novosibirsk, after which President Shukshin declared the formation of the Russian Federation. America and her OFN allies would diplomatically recognize Shukshin's government the following month. Within the span of a decade, America and her allies were able to completely reshape the balance of the Cold War by exploiting German instability and Japanese weakness. The OFN was able to gain new footholds at the expense of her adversaries in Germania and Tokyo. The upheavals of the early 1960s would be followed by a period of détente between the great powers in the late 1960s. Despite the peace of the late 60s, the oil crisis, the resurgence of a united Russia, and an increasingly assertive China would set the tone for what was to come in the 1970s.